This is the Underconsumed Knowledge podcast. Today I'm going to be going through one of my most popular blog posts to date, titled Questioning Life Assumptions and the Tyranny of the Should. If you would like to follow along, you can go to underconsumed.substack.com and search for Questioning Life Assumptions. Everyone eventually reaches a point in life where the need to question assumptions arises. This may manifest in different ways at different points in life. Whenever I pass the apartment near my girlfriend's house where the teenager loudly plays the electric guitar, I like to joke, "You don't understand me, Mom." My girlfriend says the teenager and the mother actually seem to get along quite well. A lot of people might look around in their 20s and say, "Why are all these people doing this?" Or they might pose this question's twin sibling, "Why am I not?" Cultures, beliefs, assumptions evolve over decades, centuries, and millennia. The end result for beings who can think and feel is ultimately the perpetuation of the human race, the reward of evolution. So if you feel like something is missing, or if you aren't happy, maybe it's time to take a step back and evaluate, because evolution doesn't necessarily reward us with happiness. Karen Horney was a psychoanalyst. I decidedly am not, nor am I a psychologist or a therapist. I'm just a person trying to figure things out. And I excitedly read Karen Horney's 1950 book, Neurosis and Human Growth, after finding it as a footnote in another book by a social psychologist named Carol Tavris. And I would recommend both of her books, Anger, The Misunderstood Emotion, as well as Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. I really liked Karen Horney's book, Neurosis and Human Growth, though I am told by Dr. Tavris, whom I emailed about the book, that psychoanalysis has fallen out of vogue and is very dated. But I still find a number of things Miss Horney has to say to be extremely compelling. She talks about our expectations of life, of other people, and of ourselves, dubbing this the tyranny of the should. This is how things should be as we esteem them as individuals, societies, and cultures. I should be doing this. You should be doing that. You should be treating me a certain way. She illustrates what she calls a neurotic claim. Dr. Tavris also informed me that psychology students today would no longer use the term neurosis, with an example about a train not being available when she wants to take it, and the resulting frustration that can result. The train should be available at 2:30 p.m. when I want to take it. How stupid that it is not available then. Certainly some injustices in our day-to-day life are more grave than others, but when you learn to see how you think about little things such as the dawdling pedestrian crossing the road or the driver who is having a hard time parallel parking, you can start to calm down a little bit and go through life giving other parties a bit more benefit of the doubt. People often assume that they're omniscient. They know everything about everything, as any connoisseur of Fox News or CNN might notice. We think we have all the available facts, that if you just do X, Y, and Z, life will fall into place and a magical happiness and utopia will result. And in a lot of ways, if you do the things you should do, you might be setting yourself up for success. But evolution ultimately didn't reward human happiness. It rewarded the conditions that led to 7 billion humans currently being on the Earth, a number that has increased over tenfold in the last 500 years. If you've ever been to the Natural History Museum, humans are really, really old, like hundreds of thousands of years old. So you don't have to be a math whiz to gather that modernity and civilization are, relatively speaking, kind of a new thing. In light of this, if you were feeling unsatisfied, unfulfilled, unhappy, as I was within the past few years, maybe that actually makes quite a bit of sense. Modernity isn't quite as soul-crushing as history was, so we have a lot more time to think, take it easy, ponder what exactly is going on. If you are feeling that something is missing, maybe a personal reevaluation of your philosophy of life, your shoulds, so to speak, is in order. My friends are all doctors, lawyers, engineers, are having children, have expensive real estate, and here I am holding my uniform from Hot Dog on a Stick, and I live with my folks. To a certain extent, a lot of should can put humans in a place where they can achieve happiness. It is easier to be happy when you have a little extra money in the bank. But if you become addicted to a certain kind of lifestyle, that potential for lasting, intrinsic happiness can morph into a form of slavery, and then you're stuck making boat payments. And to be sure, many people, I am sure, genuinely like having a boat, but others maybe would be just as happy without one. And I'm sure there are just as many satisfied and happy parents as there are parents who wished or think they wish they had never had children. And surely the answers to this question for them will differ, 10, 20, and 40 years from now. Different things ultimately have different meanings for different people. What do you want your life to mean for you, I think, is the question you should ask. Jonathan Haidt and Carl Rogers both point out how inescapably social creatures humans are, and if we didn't care what other people thought, we would be sociopaths. But the older you get, the more you can start to question some of the assumptions that are core to our historical human function. Yes, it is impolite and rude to fart loudly on the subway, and we really ought not to shoot people in the head who cut us off in traffic, I think most people on any given day would feel these to be simple truths. But humans are no longer on the savannah, and there's no more prehistoric creatures threatening us, and a lot of the impulses and feelings we evolved with have overstayed their practical welcome. You might start to question, as you get older, the upkeeping of appearances, and start to do the things that you want to do. Social isolation can be lonely, but it's fair to assume that we will still have friends and be allowed at the grocery store if we pull up in a Nissan Versa instead of a BMW. Carl Rogers said, "When an activity feels as though it is valuable or worth doing, it is worth doing. I have never regretted moving in directions which felt right, even though I have often felt lonely or foolish at the time." Learning to trust what you want from life doesn't have to mean a descent into booze-fueled nihilism coupled with fast cars and lots of drugs. A lot of the post-World War II pop psychology movement sort of talks about listening to your inner dictates, being true to your real self, self-realization, so on and so forth. And some of this draws from the 19th century and Kierkegaard. But what they're really saying is that you need to do some of the things with your life that you genuinely want to do. Rob Kurzban is a psychologist who writes about the modular mind and how we evolved with different brain modules that achieve certain evolutionary goals. He posits that there's no self in there. He calls the self Buzzy. He says there's no Buzzy in there pulling the strings, running the show in our brain. This is another way of saying that all of the potential things which could be considered humanly good don't necessarily add up to being compatible. There's no final life solution. Life has paradoxes, there's nuance, and there are trade-offs. So, what do you want from life? What do you want from the world? These are pretty big questions. Humans are sexually reproductive creatures, so if you want the pretty girl, a BMW might help. Others will tell you that if you're relying on the fancy car to get the girl, you're getting the wrong kind of girl. Do you want to start a family? If you aren't sure, maybe you should put the idea on ice until you've better sorted out your personal life philosophy. We have some modern society-wide assumptions that go like this. You should go to college, you should have nice stuff, you should have a family, you should get a good job. And if you want things from the world and from other people, a lot of these things will be mutually complementary. I did all of these things. I was married at 23. I had a mortgage not much later and a graduate degree in marketing. And all I wanted to do was sock away enough money so that we could pay off the mortgage and so that I could stop working. I felt this deep hatred for my work, which for me was a career in internet marketing that eventually became somewhat lucrative. Eventually, couples therapy failed, my marriage went kaput, and I entered a fumbling, figuring myself out in my late 20s. Things people like my own parents had to figure out while they were married to one another and having 2 young children. And it took about 10 years of fumbling and doing the same thing until I finally had saved enough money to say I could quit my job, if not forever, at least for a good long while. I had had enough and wanted to embark on my something else. My something else wound up entailing a lot of reading. I started with Winners Take All by Anand, I don't know how to say his name, Giridharadas, which is a great book, even if he doesn't think that Hooters and Cinnabon are respectable businesses to go and purchase things at. And I read a lot of nonfiction books about politics, something which I have an undergraduate degree in and had always been interested in. Then I found my way from political books to pop psychology books, since politics involves people, as well as philosophy. I eventually wound my way to literature, having previously deemed the genre of fiction as being mind smut and nonfiction as being the only way that someone could learn something. And in the course of all this reading, I accidentally found my own better personal philosophy of life and realized some life lessons of my own. Dostoevsky, who was a Russian author, pointed out that existence is in fact slavery, and while this sounds like a bleak assessment on the surface, objectively it's true in a sense. We have to eat, so we have to get food, and it so happens that now food comes from the grocery store and not from the savannah. I think a lot of the modern discontent which exists is a rejection of this fact and a desire to spit in its face, and it's really the dislike of the way the world is. Philosopher Karl Popper wrote of a deep felt dissatisfaction with a world which does not and cannot live up to our moral ideas and to our dreams of perfection, a reaction against the strain of our civilization and its demand for personal responsibility. But the closed society of history is gone, and our roles are no longer predestined, and we have to find our way for ourselves. Humans have capacities, and they need to use them. We want to work, even if that's not what we think of as work, as George Orwell would pointed out. A lot of political philosophy revolves around how we'll be able to remake the world to somehow better link what we want to do with our lives versus what we have to do economically in the world that has evolved. And a lot of this philosophy involves generally the bloody death of those whom are deemed to be evil. So suffice it to say, a paradox of work exists. There might be some fortunate people who find productive work, which is both economically and personally rewarding. I imagine things like, a physical therapist or a medical doctor might be among these professions. But, even a businessman who has creative challenges to overcome might find their job of creating a business and creating jobs for people to be rewarding. And I can't say that I really know what it's like to have a profession like that, as I feel like my profession is generally been more on the soul-sucking end of things in marketing and internet advertising. But ultimately, I've come to embrace that which provides me with a roof over my head and food in the fridge, and have learned to better appreciate my good fortune. Not all the things which are economically productive in life are going to feel rewarding, and vice versa. And that's really an irresolvable conflict in a society that has any form of freedom. So ultimately, the question of whether you get to lead a happy life or not resides with you. People adopt philosophies of life, and if your current life philosophy is coming up short, you need to figure out a new one. No one's going to do it for you. Australian spirit master Barry Long, who wrote books in the 70s and 80s, said, "The truth is you are responsible for your life. If you're not responsible, it's not your life, and that's absurd. Similarly, if you blame something else for what happens to you, you're giving up responsibility by giving it to others. To be responsible is to be responsible for everything that happens to you unfolding as your life. Indeed, there are continual difficulties you have to face. They may seem to have been caused by other agencies, but you have to do your best to sort them out. That's life." I never wanted to have a family because I saw it as an elongation of my slavery, manufacturing something which needed to be supported by doing the things that I already hated doing so much. And perhaps this is a decision I'll regret in older age, though I think I have moved past living with regret. I quit my job to do what I wanted to do, and that was to think about fixing politics and to try to help people somehow. I came to realize one of the best ways I could do something to help people was to lend financial assistance to young children in my own extended family who had the misfortune of being born with no fathers in the picture and are being raised by their grandmother. And this is the very same thing that I had previously found to be a very frustrating financial burden, preventing me from doing what I wanted to do. The idea that, to me, that somehow people are okay with bringing children into the world and then not loving them, not taking care of them, has always been deeply troubling. I always viewed children and having children, as being a big responsibility. So I've decided that I will try to do what I can to right this wrong in my own family, however inadequate it might be. In Tolstoy's War and Peace, he has a character, Pierre, one of the main characters in the book. And near the end of the book, he gives good color to the need for perspective in our lives. So Pierre is a political prisoner in Napoleonic... he's a political prisoner in Russia of Napoleonic France. So the French have invaded Russia with Napoleon. And Pierre discovers sort of the, Marcus Aurelian truth about really everything in life being perspective. Pierre suffering from blisters on his feet from marching as a prisoner of war of the French, and Tolstoy writes the following. While imprisoned in the shed, Pierre had learned not with his intellect, but with his whole being, by life itself, that man is created for happiness, that happiness is within him, in the satisfaction of simple human needs, and that all unhappiness arises not from privation, but from superfluity. And now, during these last 3 weeks of the march, he had learned still another new consolatory truth, that nothing in this world is terrible. He had learned that as there is no condition in which man can be happy and entirely free, so there is no condition in which he needs be unhappy and lack freedom. He learned that suffering and freedom have their limits, and that those limits are very near together, that the person in a bed of roses with one crumpled petal suffered as keenly as he now, and that when he had and that when he had put on tight dancing shoes, he had suffered just as he did now when he walked with bare feet that were covered with sores. He discovered that when he had married his wife, of his own free will as it had seemed to him, he had been no more free than now when they locked him up at night in a stable. Of all that he himself subsequently termed his sufferings, but which at the time he scarcely felt, the worst was the state of his bare, raw, and scab-covered feet. The horse flesh was appetizing and nourishing. The saltpeter flavor of the gunpowder they used instead of salt was even pleasant. There was no great cold. It was always warm walking in the daytime. And at night there were the campfires, the lice, and the lice that devoured him warmed his body. The one thing that was at first hard to bear was his feet. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he implores the reader to ask, what does life demand of you? Not to ask, what is the meaning of life? Because the meaning of life ultimately can't be known to humans. So we must make our own meaning. And our greatest freedom in life is the choice of how to respond to life. The determinists would say everything is preordained. We can't do anything to change it. And we don't even have this freedom to choose how to respond to life. But if we don't have this freedom, why should we bother living? So in my quest to do something else with my life, I strangely find myself back in a similar place, doing internet marketing part-time so that I can fulfill financial obligations to help my family. But I don't think of it the same way as I thought of it before. I can't think of any better way to use my time than to contribute financially and spiritually to 2 young children in my own family with no fathers. And I still don't like my line of work very much, genuinely, but it provides me with financial freedom and time to work on projects such as this. I think people make decisions a lot of people choose prisons of their own making, maybe inadvertently, maybe on purpose. And determinism says that people don't make these decisions. And Dostoevsky says, in one of his books, with them, one is always a victim of the environment and nothing else. Are our abilities to evaluate our lives a product of the social environment? Sure, that plays a role. But we have to play the cards we're dealt. If you can learn to trust yourself, your inner dictates, a sea of anxiety and self-mistrust could begin to wash away in time, and you can begin to live life more in accordance with what you think you should do. I believe this because I feel it for myself, and I recognize my good psychological fortune in having been raised by two loving parents in a small rural Ivy League town. But I think if it's possible for me, it's possible on some level for other people. I like to have time to ride my bicycle. I like reading books. Riding my bike brings me a lot of joy and provides me with a source of happiness. And helping my family is bringing me a source of meaning. And I would like to try to help others figure out how to better succeed in life in ways that I have. I don't accept the idea that the only way to contribute to humanity is to have children, and that there's something wrong with me because I'm in my late 30s and I don't have a car and I live with a cat. I'm not here on earth to somehow preserve someone else's standards for living. Thanks for listening.